Today we are going to take a look at the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. What in the world is it? Who made it? And why did they make it? Also, should the government really be able to tell people what they can and cannot have inside their own products? Let's take a look. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed into law in 1906 by President Theodore Roosevelt. This law was made directly after the Meat Inspection Act was signed because journalists known as muckrakers and groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union found out the awful things that were going on inside of food and drug plants and exposed the truth through journalism. One famous example of the type of literature that inspired these laws is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This piece spoke on the horrors of meat packaging plants, like the discovery that when workers would sometimes accidentally chop off their own fingers, the blood and actual finger would just be ground up in the meat that would then end up on Americans' plates. Gross, right? People could not believe what they were hearing about this stuff. They were like, oh my gosh, my world is ending. We've eaten food with human body parts in it, and I just want to know what's in all of my food and my other products. People were infuriated, and when President Teddy Roosevelt found out about all the things that were going on, he knew that something had to change, and so he signed the law into action. However, not everything was all sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows after this. The 1906 version of the Act simply said that all products had to label their ingredients, and that they weren't allowed to falsely advertise. Not that they couldn't have bad things inside of their ingredients. So while the Meat Inspection Act took care of the fingers and other sanitary issues, the Food and Drug Act didn't take care of all the unsafe things that were still going into people's products. For example, these are cocaine toothache drops that were marketed towards children. They were said to instantly cure toothaches and to put your child in a much better mood. And these are throat lozenges that had cocaine in them. They were marketed towards anyone with a vocal profession, like a singer or a teacher, and not only were they supposed to soothe your throat, but they were also supposed to put you in a mood that would allow you to perform at your best. And lastly, we have Coca-Cola. I'm sure you can all figure out where that name came from. Once the 1906 version of the law was passed, and companies were no longer allowed to label products containing bad ingredients as things like healthy and non-addictive, sales were said to have dropped by 30%. But that doesn't mean that everyone quit using the products with harmful ingredients in them. Just think of chocolate cake. We all know that too much of it is bad for us, but that certainly doesn't stop all of us from binging on it from time to time. It wasn't until 1938 that harmful ingredients were completely banned from being put inside of any of our products. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering, why 1938? It was in 1938 that people realized that some of the things going into our products really were quite dangerous. Something called elixir sulfanilamide was put out as an antibiotic. We now use this as antifreeze in our vehicles. It was marketed towards children because it was a liquid medicine, and it killed 107 people, most of them being young kids. You see, prior to 1938, tests were not required to see if a product was safe for consumption. People figured that companies would not put out something that was harmful, because that's bad for business, right? Well, wrong. Just like today, a company's main concern is always going to be making money, not spending it on tests that weren't yet required by law. While I'm sure most people felt a lot safer shopping after the change in the law, there were some people who liked the harmful drugs in their products, and they began to question if the government was taking away their natural rights by telling us what we can and cannot consume. And so the age-old question of how much power does the government really have over us began to be asked once again. So, should this law have been made? Let's think about it a little bit. People began to argue that it was their own body, and why should it matter to anyone else what they put inside of their own body? People got to thinking, and they were like, well, I can take as many cocaine tooth drops as I want to, and it's not going to harm the girl standing next to me. Well, that's not exactly true, and here's why. Think of someone who had some of those cocaine tooth drops in their car and maybe took one too many. Or a mother who is fed up with her child crying because she doesn't feel well, so she gave her child some medicine that had a bad drug in it, so that she would feel better and also be in a better mood. So really, people who use these drugs weren't just putting themselves in danger, but also those around them. You don't want to get hit by a car, and you definitely don't want your child to end up looking like this guy. Yeah. So if you think about it, the making of these laws was simply the Constitution doing its job, because the Constitution's job is to protect us. Thanks to the 1906 version of the law, kids with peanut allergies aren't going to die simply because they have no clue what's inside of their products. And thanks to the 1938 version of the law, a lot less people are going to start looking like this because of their bad habits. So, I think that this law is great. It wasn't just something that certain groups and journalists wanted, but rather something that all of society needed. And that's the end of my presentation.